Hi there. I'm coming to you from our sailboat on Lake Ontario in Toronto, and I want to provide a comprehensive overview lecture on Canada's economic strategy in the Trump tariff era. And to start off, I want to start with a little history. Not much of a history, 70, 80 years of Canadian trade strategy. And since the end of the Second World War, Canada has pursued a trade strategy rooted in multilateralism, continental integration, and rules-based trade. The 1947 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, and its successor, CUSMA, in 2020, all reflect Canada's deep economic integration with the United States. Over 75% of Canadian exports have historically gone to the US, and importing, well, we've imported almost 350 billion of American products alone in 2024, not including services, making this both a strength and a vulnerability. But that was then, and we have a new world order. Global economic landscape has shifted. Europe and Southeast Asia now represent mature, innovation-driven economies with growing middle classes and robust infrastructure, albeit in the context of population changes and migrations. Canada has recognized this shift and is actively diversifying trade to reduce its dependencies on the US and to tap into these dynamic markets. The European Union and ASEAN nations are increasingly seen as strategic partners in a multipolar economic world. And so Ottawa has goals. We want to strengthen our sovereignty, emphasize our stability and strategic autonomy, and in response to the Trump administration's 35% blanket tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by CUSMA, the Canadian federal government, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has articulated a three-pronged strategy. Economic sovereignty, reduce reliance on U.S. markets and supply chains. Resilience, to build domestic capacity in critical sectors like energy, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing. And improve our strategic autonomy, using trade policy to reinforce our geopolitical independence, including things like our stance on global issues, like Palestinian statehood. So part of that, a large part of that, is leveraging the comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union and the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Asia-Pacific nations. These two agreements provide preferential access to over 1.5 billion consumers. The government is busily expanding trade missions in places like Germany, Vietnam, and Japan. They're offering incentives for exporters to pivot to these markets, and they're streamlining customs and regulatory alignment under these agreements. The thing to note here is that once set, these trade corridors are going to be sunk costs and incredibly difficult to undo. But it's not just external-looking ideas. There's also internal trade reform, a pan-Canadian effort. Recognizing that internal trade barriers cost the economy, as much as $130 billion annually, the federal government has partnered with provincial and territorial premiers to harmonize regulations across provinces, to digitize provincial, interprovincial trade documentation, and to launch a new Pan-Canadian Trade Mobility Council to oversee these reforms. As an example, Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, for instance, has publicly urged Ottawa to, quote, fight back and unleash the full potential of domestic trade. And outside of government, on the industrial response, supply chain re-engineering. Major industries are already adapting. In the automotive sector, there's a company called Magna International that's shifting parts of its supply chain to British Columbia for the eastern part of the world, and Mexico to obviously look after its U.S. business. In agriculture, there's prairie grain exporters are rerouting shipments through the port of Prince Rupert to Asia. And in energy, Suncor and Enbridge are investing in liquid natural gas terminals in Newfoundland and British Columbia to serve European and Asian markets. Mining's another one. Province of Saskatchewan is working hard to realize the value of potash deliveries via the Port of Vancouver. About a third of the world's fertilizer depends on Saskatchewan potash. Now, I found this timeline with a company called Macmillan Supply Chain Group. It's a logistics company, and they talk about cross-provincial supply chain efficiency, Hudson's Bay Railway expansion, freight and distribution strategies in development, and their objective of becoming a global logistics leader. And I think this is just part of what's happening. Now, all of this infrastructure investment is leading towards building east, west, north corridors to compensate for the overwhelming south corridor that we've always dealt with. And to support this pivot, the federal government has announced over $180 billion in infrastructure investments, including expansion of the ports of both Halifax and Vancouver, for example, upgrades to the Arctic Gateway, to Nunavut and Northwest Territories, and a new National Trade Corridor Fund to support rail and highway modernization. And to that end, private sector partners like Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Rail are also investing in logistics hubs and intermodal terminals. Now, there's a timeline for this realignment, and it's not set in stone. According to the Bank of Canada, Canada's GDP could rebound by late 2025 under a de-escalation scenario. However, full trade realignment, where non-US exports finally match pre-tariff levels, may take 3 to 5 years, depending on things like global demand or infrastructure readiness or business adaptation rates. And of course, there's always one looming wild card, and that is the CUSMA renegotiation. In 2026, CUSMA has a review clause that could be triggered, and Trump will almost certainly want to renegotiate it in order to avoid having CUSMA extend as it is to 2036. I say renegotiate in quotation marks because, well, it is Donald Trump. So while current exemptions under CUSMA have softened the blow of Trump's tariffs, a renegotiation could reopen disputes over dairy, over digital trade, and dispute resolution. It could potentially lead to further U.S. protectionism given Trump's real goals. And it could force Canada to choose. Do we want deeper integration with the U.S. or greater independence? All right. Canada's post-August 2025 economic strategy is, in my opinion, a bold pivot towards resilience, diversification, and sovereignty. And while the road ahead is going to be complex, the country is leveraging its global partnerships, internal unity, and industrial adaptability to chart a new course in this new, more chaotic world. The question that I'm going to try to cover in another video is, how do we pay for all this? And although I haven't mentioned artificial intelligence and the other issue connected to it at the hip, which is cybersecurity, these are important issues, and I'd like to cover them in more detail, especially cybersecurity, in another video. And so I hope you'll look for those. Thanks for watching.